Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Last Duel from 2021. Oh boy. I think there's only one right way to start out this video, and that's to say, Ridley Scott, go fuck yourself. I will explain that later. This is a historical drama film based in the 14th, 15th century in France during sort of the 100 Years' War period. I am not the most well-versed in mid to late medieval European history, but it is a setting that I enjoy, and I like seeing people tell different stories with it. And there's been sort of a waning of content in this sort of area for a little while, but that's not to say that we necessarily need a resurgence of it. It's directed by Ridley Scott, and it features Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, and Adam Driver. Now, some of you will remember from my Logan Lucky review and a few others that I'm actually a big fan of Adam Driver. I think he has a lot of acting range. I think he can adapt his acting style very well to a variety of different settings. And I would say this is no exception. Adam Driver's probably, of the three, by far the best. But this movie is bad. It's long and it's bad. And it's not without its merits, but for 2.5 hours, I was not having fun. The plot of the story is simple. It is a conflict that escalates over a period of time during which a number of relationships, political relationships mostly, as well as personal friendships, evolve and lead to conflicts that ultimately culminate in, spoilers, a duel. Now, one of the biggest problems with this is the structure. I've heard this compared to Rashomon, the Akira Kurosawa film. And I've talked about my love of Kurosawa before. And I feel dirty even uttering the name Rashomon in the same sentence as this film. It is only comparable in the sense that the film tells the same story 3 different times from 3 different perspectives. That's as far as it goes. Now get Rashomon out of your head, because this has none of the nuance or good writing or filmmaking capability that makes Rashomon so impressive. It is 2.5 hours, of which I want to say 1 hour and 45 minutes is spent retelling the same story 3 times. And it is not told that differently. Unfortunately, that is the conceit of the film, is that the important thing here is to see the small differences between perspectives and experiences. Unfortunately, it's not compelling. The perspectives that are shown are all very dour. And given the era and the people that you're dealing with and the state of the place that they're in, the era that they're in, and all of the things to do with the social, economic, and political things of the time, unsurprisingly, there's going to be some misery. I think anybody who watches something that is set in a either like historical medieval or medieval fantasy setting, and hasn't been presented with a, you know, overtly fantastical view, is expecting some level of just like, oh, this is inherently kind of gross because it's from 700 years ago, and the like all of the social aspects of the world at that time are kind of inherently nasty, literally and figuratively. But the problem is that you can get around some of those things with good writing and good direction and good acting. You can make a dirty, nasty world full of backstabbing and political intrigue fascinating. And it's weird that I'm about to say this, but I think Game of Thrones is a perfect example of that. For the most part, Game of Thrones is not that fantastical. It's fairly low fantasy. And most of the engagement that people get from it and the interest that people have in it is not, ooh, we got dragons. It's, oh, the political machinations between these different houses are all like interesting, and the interactions and the subversion that's done are all interesting in their own right. And even though these people are dirty and like mean and like all kind of inherently villains, you still like are fascinated by them. This movie does none of that. All of the main characters are unpleasant for one reason or another. The first perspective, and it's intentional, as far as I can tell. The first perspective the story is told from is unpleasant because you're watching. It's not. Each of these perspectives is not shown without an inherent criticism to the way that it's displayed. So, from the first perspective, you get a perspective of somebody who believes that they are in the right, that they are honorable, they are that they have everything. They're the best person that they can be. But the perspective shows them that, like, even within their own perspective, shows that they may believe that, and the unreliable narrator aspect of this and the foibles of their perspective, even within that, still shows that they're kind of an unpleasant person, who there are perfectly valid reasons why people would dislike them, so on and so forth. The second perspective is similarly like a perspective of somebody who thinks they're in the right and thinks they have some, humanity to them, but that their hand is forced, and that their perspective is they're in troublesome situations, but not really through fault of their own, and that the things that are happening to them are, they're just doing their best. Whereas the overarching thing from their perspective is, oh, this is clearly somebody who thinks that they project themselves into the world in a way that they don't, and is so self-satisfied that they have tricked themselves into believing that this is the case. And then the third perspective, which is arguably the one that we're supposed to take the most belief from, and we'll get into the structure of the story and the writing, and talk about that one in particular in a little bit, is so miserable to watch that even if it was 100% accurate to what really happened, it's still miserable to watch. The character is in situations that are unpleasant. There is no true comeuppance. There is no, if they are wronged, it is never brought to a resolution. It's just kind of sickening to watch the third perspective. I guess ultimately I'm sort of spoiling this for very much for the tone. Not even if I'm not hitting the plot, but still. Anyway, sorry about that if you're too worried about that, but I don't recommend watching this. And then the conclusion of the film, which has the duel and the outcome of the duel and the whatever steps of reconciliation have to or appear to be happening between the various characters. The conclusion is deeply unsatisfying, and deliberately so, because it's the narrative itself is repeatedly telling you through the last 2 hours, these people are all terrible and it all is misery, and even if this came to true justice, everyone would still be miserable afterwards because there's no justice. And listen, I'm not going to say you need to wrap up your story and give it a happy ending or anything like that. There is no way to end this story with a happy ending, but it's just, you have to make concessions when you write, that if you like in a fantasy setting, it is possible to write a villain, like a very, mustache twirling villain. It's possible to write a mustache twirling villain who wins, but that you still feel satisfied about the conclusion because of the context in which it's delivered. And that is not the case in this film. You have a bunch of people who don't get what they want, don't get justice, don't get whatever. And at the end of the film, all you can conclude at the end of the film is the world is now worse. The end of the story is bad for everyone, and it's just it's unsatisfying. It hasn't taught you anything. There are some more there are some both contemporaneous, like, moral address things that are being addressed, like the lack of justice, like the treatment of certain people. But even worse than that, it seems to, it's drawing parallels to real world modern concerns, but it's not unsubtle, but it's not very deep, and it doesn't actually say anything at the end. It's just like, oh yeah, you remember this is a problem? And you're like, yeah, I guess that's a social issue. I already knew that, but go for it. And then the very, very end of the film it's like I laughed out loud at the very, very end, because it's just like one last insult, 30 seconds before the credits roll. And if you happen to see this film, let me know what you think about that. So you have a film that's too long because it's replaying a lot of the same content with very minimal changes to it. And I'm not even going to say that that's without merit, because there are certain elements. There's one fascinating thing I noticed that there's a few things like this, but this is the most notable one for me. There is a line that is said it's the same line, but depending on whose perspective you're watching, it is said by 3 different people. It's just kind of neat. It's not particularly like stunning as a writing technique. It's just like as a very clear indicator of matters of perspective kind of things. It's fascinating that it's there. But for the most part, it spends like 30 to 45 minutes in each perspective. And for most of it, I was sitting there going, all right, come on, let's move. I know. And that's probably the reason why this is compared to Rashomon. Rashomon structurally is pretty linear, showing one perspective after the other, versus a lot of more modern types of unreliable narrator narratives where you get intercut flashbacks or intercut perspectives that make the film more dynamic to watch, and also keep the pacing at a regular, keep the pacing regular, basically. And don't let you drop the ball. But when you spend 30 minutes watching an arc of a story, and then it suddenly decides it's time to rewind you to be the beginning of that story again and show a lot of the same content, it's very overt of that they're not trying to do this, but it's overtly reminding you and taking you out of the film that, oh, this is so close. These scenes are so close to each other. They're just alternate takes of the same scene, basically. Like somebody at like the director just they're so close that in a worse case, if I didn't know they were doing this deliberately, I would say, oh, the director did 10 takes of every one of these scenes and then played the best 3 of each, which is a bizarre thing to say about a film. But when you have these repeated scenes that are not that different, it really starts to grate, and it really starts to overstay its welcome. Now, as far as the setting goes, and elements like the sets and costuming, a lot of it is really good. Now, like I said, I'm not a historical expert in this era at all. I know very little of it, but it is the things that were produced in order to produce this film, the costumes, the weaponry, the things used for horseback and stuff like that, is all clearly really well made, and there's a lot of attention to detail. Whether it's actually historically accurate, I don't know. It really doesn't matter that much. There are some elements. Well, we'll get back to that. Unfortunately, this film is fucking ugly. It's just ugly. And this is where I'm going to start talking about Ridley Scott. Because Ridley Scott is a crappy director. I'm sorry. Ridley Scott wants to believe that he is an auteur. And there are lots of people who seem to think he's an auteur. And there is a point in my life where I might have said that Ridley Scott was one of my favorite directors. But that was before I got more movie viewing under my belt. Ridley Scott directed 2 incredible films, Alien and Blade Runner, in 1979 and 1982. And those are both visually spectacular films. And they're dirty and grimy, and yet they manage to show off beautiful visuals and smart technical use of the camera. And somehow, in the subsequent 40 years, pretty much everything else I've ever seen Ridley Scott direct is just ugly. He's got 10 other movies on his list that I've seen, and they're all most of them are bad in general, but they're also particularly ugly. And this one is no exception. It is washed in this, it varies between scenes, but it's washed in either gray, brown, or purple, or sometimes kind of blue, in a way that is supposed to, it's very like early to mid 2000s. This is how we show the dirty medieval era, in terms of lighting choices and post-processing choices for the visuals. And instead it just, I mean, it's as bad as it's ever been. That's not to say that there's clearly some competent people on this film that are doing competent lighting and stuff like that, because sometimes the compositions you go, oh, they've got some smart lighting in this scene, or they're focusing it all over there to try and draw the eye over there, except for then it's washed in this horrible post-processing or this horrible color filter that muddies the whole thing and makes the whole thing ugly as sin. And on top of how just the lighting and the color is muddied to the point of beyond recognition, there is very little to compliment in terms of the cinematography. And I will say that both in the dramatic intrigue scenes, which are largely on tripod or on dolly or on things like that, where framing is just kind of mediocre to poor. Sometimes there's some bizarre lens choices where it's like, why does this look so distorted? Oh, it's because they don't seem to have put the right lens on this camera for this shot. And so this character is all distorted because the way they framed it is with the character on the edge of the screen. And because of the way the lens works, they look weird. And I don't know if that's a mistake or a deliberate choice that's just ugly. And whichever one it is, doesn't matter. It still looks bad. And then you have the combat scenes, of which they are sort of heavily front-loaded, where you get into these scrappy, kind of more historically accurate medieval combat. It's, again, not an expert, but like it's a little bit more towards the like, it's less the knights in shining armor thing and more the nobility on horseback, and then getting into the muck. And there are a couple of things that I saw with like fighting techniques that I've seen just kind of cursorily in like modern historical research documents about how people actually fought in the era. So it's interesting to see some sword work and use of unusual weapons that are not typical to the genre because they don't look that spectacular. And so as a result, it gets like even more grungy and dirty and kind of unpleasant to view as a result. And in a better film, I would compliment that. Except not only is it all ugly, and I don't know how much of the choreography to actually credit to whom, but the whole thing is ruined by the camera work, where in order to portray this as like a, hyperventilating, dirty, like panicked combat, they swing the camera all over the place. It's just flying all over the screen. It's like it's like watching a cell phone video. It's terrible. And when you have competent choreography and some competent like fighting going on, I don't know if how much of it is the actual actors versus stunt doubles, but like when you have actual technical competence there, why would you fucking swing the camera all over the place? And that is something that is all over the things Ridley Scott has made in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it's gotten progressively worse. It's gotten progressively uglier. And so it's just a miserable mess visually for a whole bunch of different reasons. Now let's talk about the casting. Ridley Scott did not write this. The screenplay is written by, I'm going to screw up her name, Nicole Holofcener, and Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. And I'm not going to comment specifically on the writing because I actually don't. No, wait, I am. For very briefly, most of the writing is acceptable, and most of the problems with the story are structural, not the actual writing. However, sidebar for a second, there's some really weird word selection in certain scenes that just pulls me out of it, where either for like linguistics reasons or just weird word choice in general, there's a couple like nobody's doing a faux French accent. Nobody's doing a faux English accent either. They're just sort of doing variations of their own voices. And actually, I would probably say that's the right choice. But when you use weird words that are clearly out of place because you're trying not to do like a weird Middle English or Old English Shakespearean style of dialogue, but you're also trying not to write just completely modern dialogue, and you use words like victuals and libertine, both of which are like just anachronistic inherently. It's just weird. I don't know. Somebody needed to do some sort of like pseudo historical editing pass on the script and just go, why did you pick these words? Just tone it down like a notch and it'll be better. Anyway, that's the script. So I don't know. I'm not going to criticize the screenplay too much. However, I am going to criticize Ben Affleck and Matt Damon because I don't know. Like, obviously, when you're tacked onto the screenplay, whatever your actual contribution to that screenplay is kind of irrelevant. But if you're a name like Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, then you can use that as leverage to say, we want to make this film and it's going to make money because it has our names on it. And that's despite that you have Ben Affleck of the Frosted Tips and Matt Damon of the mullet in your movie. It was just distracting. The names are too big, and Ben Affleck is the worst of the two in terms of like, dude, did you even try and act here? It's a weird character that you're putting on here. Ben Affleck is truly awful. Matt Damon is mediocre and just distracting most of the time. He doesn't have a lot of... I mean, it's ups and downs on my feelings with his acting, but I don't think he works well here, and his appearance is just distracting, though not as distracting as Ben Affleck. Adam Driver is slightly distracting in his name and appearance, but like I think he fits very well. Jodie Comer, who plays the wife of Matt Damon's character, puts on a pretty good performance, but it's hard to judge because it is inherently a restrained performance, and also she doesn't have a lot of writing to work with. She's not exactly talkative. So I'm just gonna give her a pass on that. I think she's fine. But if I didn't know any better, I would call this stunt casting, and I would say that the whole thing is completely ruined by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. As it is, it should be ruined by the two of them, but the rest of the other elements of the film are also bad, and therefore we've got bigger concerns. There are some other elements related to the performances and the editing that I don't think I need to dig into all the niceties of. In particular, though, there are the music and the audio editing really is kind of all over the place. And there's one transition in particular with one very loud and very inappropriate musical cue near the middle of the film that was just like really brought into focus how much didn't work in it. And though I'm not going to criticize the screenplay or the direction too much anymore, this film also demands a content warning for things you probably shouldn't be too surprised by in a drama from the Middle Ages, but elements that are depicted so graphically that even for somebody who doesn't have like a particularly focused revulsion to that, they are still kind of offensive to the senses, and are visually drawn out in a way that I really just wish hadn't been there. Yeah. Content warnings all over this thing, I think. So let's come back to Ridley Scott for a second. In addition to being not as good as he thinks he is, he's an asshole. He's been repeatedly shown to be an asshole, a self-righteous asshole, in many interviews over a long period of time. But the one thing in particular, which it's not even a personal offense thing, it's just like so misguided that I just want to call it out explicitly, is that he went on Mark Maron's podcast and blamed this movie's bombing at the box office on apathetic millennials looking at their phones. No, really, that's not a joke. He actually said that. Like, they're looking at their phones. Holy shit, dude. No. If anything, I would say that millennials are probably the group that has the millennials and Gen Xers are probably the group that has the most, the lion's share of the people in it who appreciate Ridley Scott's historical work and have continued to support him. And even if he was 100% correct, which would be stupid because holy shit, don't blame a whole like, you don't get to do that ever. As an artist, you don't get to say, well, it's a whole generation that just doesn't appreciate my work. Well, my guy, then you either have to make something different that people actually want, or you have to be okay with your art not being appealing to people. Those are the two options. You don't just get to say, well, this movie is good, they just don't get it because they're millennials. Go fuck yourself. From me and every other generation above and below me, you make crappy movies and you've been doing it for 40 years. Learn to make better films. I don't understand why people continue to treat Ridley Scott like he's some kind of auteur. He does not fit into the auteur title because he does not have a style that is legible enough or consistent enough to get him that branding. Not even remotely. The best thing the closest thing he gets to being an auteur is that he makes pretty consistently mediocre to bad films. He also cursed out some interviewer on some other show who compared it to who like made mention of Kingdom of Heaven, which is a whole other saga of filmmaking. Yeah, you know what? I'm done here. Fuck you, Ridley Scott. This movie is pretty bad, pretty offensive, overstays its welcome, is just ugly, and makes it, while it's probably like while it is a passable film and no singular element of it is so exceedingly offensive that I'm like upset about the film itself or want it to be deleted off the earth, the the collection of parts here, it just makes me sad. It just makes me sad. There's a few good elements in here that could have been really good. This thing needs a dramatic overhaul, and it could have been really good. Anyway. Thank you guys for watching another grumpy episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist. And I'll see you guys for something different next time.